The day they read the probate papers in the back room of Holt and Mercer Mercantile, 11 people laughed at me. Not the quiet kind of laughter, not the polite kind that comes with a hand over the mouth and eyes that look away. This was the full ugly sound that rises from people who have finally been given permission to be cruel, the kind that fills a room and bounces off the tin ceiling and finds every corner and stays there long after the mouths have closed. Two store clerks leaned against the counter, pretending to sort nails, watching with their mouths open. Three ranch hands sat on flour barrels in the corner, passing a flask between them, like the whole thing was entertainment laid on just for them. The freight agent stood near the door with his arms crossed and his chin up. The Methodist preacher's wife sat in a ladder-back chair with her gloved hands folded in her lap, and she did not cover her smile. The town constable had his boots up on a crate and his hat pushed back, and the expression of a man watching a dog try to climb a fence. It was never going to clear. Mrs. Ida Holt stood at the center of the room with the papers in her hands. She was the probate custodian, the merchant's widow, a woman whose jaw never seemed to unclench, not even when she spoke, not even when she smiled, which was rare. She wore black bombazine the way some women wear armor, not because they are in mourning, but because they want you to know they have survived things you have not. She read the document aloud in a voice that was flat and precise and entirely without mercy. 12 acres of land in the Little Missouri breaks 9 miles south of Medora. One standing structure described in the county records as a single-room timber cabin. One deteriorating stand of cottonwood and box elder along a seasonal creek. No livestock, no equipment, no improvements of note, no cash value assessed. She folded the papers. She looked at me with eyes the color of old ice. "Well, Miss Rent," she said, "your aunt has left you 12 acres of wind, a dying stand of cottonwood, and a shack fit for storing turnips. Even the dead can hand a girl a joke." The ranch hands laughed loudest. One of them slapped his knee. The freight agent shook his head slowly, like he had seen this kind of thing before and expected nothing better. The preacher's wife made a small sound in the back of her throat that might have been sympathy and might have been satisfaction. It was impossible to tell the difference. I was 16 years old. I had 93 cents in my coat pocket, a carpet bag with one extra dress, a wool blanket, a tin cup, and a copy of a seed almanac I had taken from the shelf at the Episcopal Girls' Home in Jamestown because nobody had told me I couldn't. I had nowhere to sleep that night. I had nowhere to sleep the night after that. I did not cry. I stood in that back room with 11 people laughing at the thing a dead woman had left me, and I felt something happen inside of my chest that I did not have a name for yet. Not anger, not shame. Something quieter than both of those. Something that went very still and then went bright, the way a coal goes bright just before it catches. 3 words came into my head, clear and sharp as struck glass. Firewood, walls, warmth. I did not know where they came from. I did not know what they meant. I only knew they arrived at the exact moment the laughter was loudest, and they did not leave. Mrs. Ida Holt handed me the probate envelope and turned back to her ledger. The ranch hands finished their flask. The constable put his boots back on the floor and stood up and walked out without looking at me. One by one, the room emptied until it was just me and the smell of old tobacco and the sound of the wind finding the gaps in the mercantile walls. I picked up my carpet bag. I walked out into the October afternoon. I did not look back. My father died in 1879 when his freight wagon overturned descending a cut bank on the Yellowstone Trail. He was 31 years old. My mother lasted until the following March, taking and washing through a wet winter until the cold got into her lungs and her lungs gave up, and then everything else followed. After that, I became something people passed around. 5 months with a cousin in Bismarck ended when she remarried and said the house was too small. 4 months with a farming family outside Mandan ended when I corrected the husband's seed counts out loud at the supper table, and he decided I was too clever for honest work. 7 months at the Episcopal Girls' Home in Jamestown ended when I aged out of their charity program, but not out of hunger. 6 weeks doing kitchen work at Mrs. Nola Peck's boarding house right here in Medora ended when the owner's son would not leave me alone, and Mrs. Peck decided the problem was me. I read everything I could find: manuals, almanacs, railroad circulars, stove catalogs. Whatever was left on shelves or stuffed in corners or dropped in the mud outside the freight office. Mrs. Peck had called it vanity. The farming family had called it proof that I didn't know my place. The cousin in Bismarck had called it dangerous. I called it the only thing I had. The inheritance was a failed timber claim in a cottonwood draw above the Little Missouri Breaks, and everyone in Medora knew the place. They called it Dory's kindling patch because the trees were crooked and the soil was thin and the cabin was too small to board hands or winter livestock. The woman who had lived there, my father's aunt, a woman I had never met and barely knew existed, had bought the relinquished claim in 1863 for $18, a price so low it told you everything about what the land was worth. They said she had been strange. They said she had lined her walls with wood like a squirrel gone mad. They said she had spent 22 winters doing something nobody understood, and then she had died alone and nobody had cared enough to find out what. The whole town knew the land was a joke, and now the joke was mine. A freighter named Cobb owed a favor to the livery and wanted nothing to do with conversation. He loaded my carpet bag into the back of a mule cart without speaking and climbed up to the bench without looking at me. I climbed up on the other side. We left Medora in the early afternoon with the sun already tilting west and the temperature dropping with the shadow of every cloud. The road south started decent enough. Packed dirt, wagon ruts, the kind of track a person could follow without thinking. But after the first 4 miles, it began to fall apart. The ruts got shallow, then disappeared. The track narrowed until the branches of the scrub oak scraped both sides of the cart and left long, pale scratches in the wood. Cobb didn't look back at me once. The Little Missouri Breaks opened up in the last hour before dark. I had never seen land like that. The river had carved the plateau into a maze of buttes and coulees, exposed layers of clay and scoria, striped in rust and gray and dull yellow formations that had no business being beautiful and were anyway. From a distance, it looked like God had started building something and walked away in the middle. Up close, it looked worse, raw and strange and older than anything I had words for. The draw came into view in the last of the light, a shallow fold in the bluffs, sheltered on 3 sides by eroded clay ridges, with a stand of cottonwood and box elder running along a dry creek bed at the bottom. The trees were not impressive. They were crooked and wind-bent with split bark and branches that looked like they had been in too many fights and lost most of them. Dory's kindling patch. I understood the name now. The cabin sat at the base of the draw where the cottonwoods were thickest. One room, maybe 12 by 14 feet. The roof sagged in the middle like an old horse's back. The walls were made of logs that had never been properly chinked, and the gaps between them were wide enough to see the last gray light of the evening sky through from the inside. The stovepipe leaned hard to the east and had a look of deep personal discouragement. The door had swollen in its frame. Cobb had to put his shoulder into it to force it open. Inside, the smell hit me first. Mouse nests and old ash and something damp that had been damp for a very long time. The floor was packed earth with a few rough planks laid over the worst spots. The stove was a small box model, rusted at the seams but intact. One window on the south wall covered with greased paper over cracked glass that let in a smear of dirty light. A bed frame made of rough-cut poles. A table that wobbled when I touched it. A shelf with 3 tin cups in a cookpot with a hole in the bottom. Cobb set my carpet bag inside the door and did not come any further. "You sure about this?" he asked. I wasn't sure about anything, but the document in my carpet bag said this rotting room in a dead-end draw belonged to me, and I had nowhere else to go. "I'm sure," I said. He left before full dark. I listened to the cart creak back up the track until I couldn't hear it anymore. Then there was just the wind in the cottonwoods, making that sound like a knife being sharpened, and the settling sounds of a building that had been empty for 3 years, and the particular quality of silence that belongs to places very far from other people. I did not sleep that first night. I sat on the edge of the bed frame with my coat still on and watched the dark corners of the room and thought about walking back to Medora. 9 miles on a packed road, Mrs. Peck's kitchen, a roof that didn't leak, food I didn't have to trap or gather. All I had to do was walk back. Before dawn, before anyone saw. But something kept me in that chair. Something about those 3 words that had come into my head in the probate room, sharp as struck glass and just as clear. Firewood, walls, warmth. I didn't know what they meant yet, but they meant something. I could feel the weight of it, the way you feel the weight of a door before you know what's on the other side. I got up before dawn and started finding out what I had. The cabin was worse in daylight. The northwest corner had sunk so badly that the wall logs had separated from the roof beam, and I could see gray sky through the gap. The chinking between the logs had fallen out in long sections, leaving finger-wide cracks where the wind came through like it owned the place, which in a practical sense it did. The stove worked after I cleared the ash and laid a small fire with dead branches from outside, but the heat rose straight up and out through the leaking roof, and the room was barely warmer than the open air. The floor under the bed platform had a strange hollow sound when I stepped on it. Not rotted, just hollow. I got down on my knees and looked closer. The planks had been nailed down carefully, but one corner was loose, like someone had pried it up more than once and pressed it back down more than once. I counted from the north wall. Third plank. I pulled it up, then the one beside it, then the one beside that. Underneath, set into the packed earth of the floor, was a nailed pine box wrapped in oilcloth that had kept out most of the damp. My hands were shaking when I lifted it out. Not from cold, from something I couldn't name yet. Something between fear and recognition, as if some part of me already understood what this was before the rest of me had caught up. I carried it to the table. I unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside the box were 9 ledger-sized notebooks, each one thick with small, precise handwriting. 2 folded maps, hand-copied, showing wind patterns across the territory with annotations in pencil along every margin. A carpenter's rule with measurements marked in careful pencil, strokes along the wooden edge, distances, heights, notes about wood species. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped separately in a square of canvas, a bundle of letters tied with brown twine. The notebooks were numbered, not by year, not by date. The first one said in small letters on the cover, "First cold." The second said, "Second cold." The third said, "After the blue norther." They were dated by winters, not by calendars. Someone had lived in this cabin and counted time by how many times she had survived. I opened the first notebook. The handwriting was small and exact, filling every line on every page as if paper were as precious as anything else in this place, which it probably was. The first sentence I read stopped me completely. "A thin wall is a promise to the wind." I sat down on the floor with my back against the wall and read until the light failed. Her name was Dory Rent, my father's aunt, a woman I had never met and barely knew existed until Mrs. Ida Holt read the probate papers in that back room, and the whole town laughed. She had lived in this cabin for 22 winters, not because she couldn't leave, because she was trying to understand something. The notebooks were a record, careful, systematic, relentless, of every cold snap, every wind direction, every frost pattern she had observed over more than 2 decades. She had measured the temperature at floor level every single morning for 12 straight winters. She had recorded how fast the stove heat dissipated depending on the direction of the wind outside. She had sketched the cracks in the walls and tracked which ones let in the most draft and what happened to those cracks through freeze and thaw cycles year after year. She was not writing a diary. She was conducting an investigation. And what she was really investigating was failure. How heat escaped, where walls failed, what happened to a small room when winter hit hard and the logs were thin and the wind found every gap and the stove burned through your wood supply 3 times as fast as it should. She had tried everything the frontier knew. Rechinking the walls each fall, hanging blankets over the worst gaps, stuffing moss and clay into the cracks. None of it worked for long. The cold always found its way back in. "This cabin loses warmth the way a man loses blood from a gut wound," she wrote in the notebook marked 4th cold. "Slow and steady and fatal if you don't find the wound." She had found it. The wound was the walls themselves. The logs were not thick enough. The chinking failed every season. The gaps let in moving air, and moving air carried heat away faster than any stove could replace it. She had measured this. She had proven it to herself with numbers. And then she had started experimenting with something the frontier had never thought to try on. In the notebook marked 7th cold, there was a diagram. It showed the cabin from above, a rough square with a smaller square inside it. The space between the 2 squares was labeled in her careful hand, "Stacked wood split side inward floor to roof." Next to the diagram she had written, "Dead air is better than moving air. Wood does not conduct heat the way stone does." What if the fuel itself became the wall before it became the fire? She had stacked firewood against the interior walls, not piled carelessly in a corner the way every settler in the territory kept their wood stacked deliberately, methodically, split aside facing inward with a hand-width gap between the wood stack and the log wall behind it to create a dead airspace that neither the wind nor the cold could move through. She had measured the temperatures before and after. The north wall sweated frost on the inside during the worst of January, she wrote. But the wood behind my stack was drawn. The air between the stacks held still. The stove heat stayed in the room instead of bleeding out. I read that passage 3 times. Then I read it again. She hadn't discovered magic. She had discovered physics. Wood doesn't conduct heat the way metal or stone does. Stacked wood traps pockets of still air between the pieces. Still air doesn't move, so it doesn't carry heat away. She had essentially built an insulated interior wall out of the same firewood she was going to burn anyway, and the insulation came first before the fuel because the insulation was what made the fuel worth burning. The wood had to become wall first, then fuel, in that order. Not because she was spending less wood than before, but because she was spending it at the right moment, and in a Dakota winter moment is everything. I understood it, in my bones and my hands, in the part of my mind that had been reading almanacs and stove catalogs for years, because I had nothing else. I understood exactly what she had done and exactly why it worked. But then I turned to the last notebook, 22nd cold. The handwriting inside was the same small, careful, precise. She had recorded the temperatures. She had noted the wind direction. She had sketched the walls and marked which courses were ready to be burned and which still had seasons left in them. She had written observations about the cottonwood and box elder standing outside, about which trees were worth cutting and which should be left for seed. She had been right up until the end, a woman conducting an investigation. The final entry was dated January 1882. After that, nothing. Just blank pages, white and clean and empty as new snow going on for 40 pages to the back cover. She had died before she finished. She had spent 22 winters building and refining a system that could change how people survived, the winters of the Dakota Territory, a system that was almost complete, almost proven, almost ready, and then she had died and nobody had cared enough to come out here and find out what she had been doing, and the notebooks had been waiting under the third plank from the north wall for 3 years, waiting for someone to come and finish what she had started. I sat on the floor of that cabin for a long time after I understood that. Long enough for the light to shift and the cold to come up through the packed earth floor and find the thin places in my coat. Long enough for the cottonwoods outside to begin their evening sound, that low, dry, persistent whisper that was not quite wind and not quite voice and not quite either. Then I remembered the letters. I picked up the bundle from the bottom of the box. Brown twine carefully knotted. 7 envelopes. I turned the first one over. The address on the front stopped my breath. Miss Elsa Rent, care of Mrs. Ida Holt, Episcopal Girls' Home, Jamestown, Dakota Territory. My name, in Dory's careful handwriting. My name on letters written to me, addressed to a place I had lived for 7 months, sent care of the woman who had stood in the probate room 2 days ago and read the will with flat eyes and handed me the joke. 7 letters. I counted them again. 7. I opened the oldest one. The date at the top was a March of 1881, 2 years before I arrived in Medora, more than a year before Dory died. She had known I was at the girls' home. She had written to ask for me. She had asked in plain and careful language whether the Rent girl, if she is bookish and stubborn, as I have been told, might be sent to the claim for a season to learn what I have been working on. She had written that she had no one else to pass it to. She had written that the work was too important to die with her. She had written twice more. The second letter was dated July 1881. The third was October. Then 4 more through the first months of 1882, growing shorter and more urgent as her health failed and winter came on. None of them had ever been forwarded. Mrs. Ida Holt had received every one of these letters. She had accepted them at the freight counter or found them in the postal delivery or had them placed in her hands by the writer who came through on the Jamestown route. She had read them. She must have read them because the probate envelope had contained Dory's handwritten note about the third plank from the north wall, which meant she had opened at least one piece of Dory's correspondence carefully enough to know there was more than one document inside. She had read them. She had kept them. She had said nothing. She had stood in that back room 2 days ago and read the will out loud and waited for the laughter and let the whole town call the inheritance a joke handed to a girl. And she had done all of it knowing that these letters existed, knowing that Dory had spent the last year of her life trying to find me. I put the letters down on the table. I looked at the walls of the cabin, the thin logs, the gaps in the chinking, the wind coming through like the room was open to the sky. The dying stand of cottonwood outside crooked and windburned, and full of exactly the kind of firewood a person would need if they were going to stack it floor to ceiling against four walls and build a system that could hold heat in the worst cold the territory had ever seen. Then I looked at the notebooks, 9 of them, 22 winters of careful work, measurements and observations and diagrams, and the specific practical knowledge of a woman who had spent more than 2 decades learning exactly one thing: how to make a bad room survive a hard winter. She had left me everything I needed: the knowledge, the tools, the land, the wood. She had sent for me when she was alive, and when that had been taken from her, she had buried everything under the third plank from the north wall and trusted that whoever came to finish it would be someone who knew how to look. All I had to do was find the wound in the walls and stop the bleeding. The first hard freeze came in November. I was not ready. I had spent October learning the land, walking the draw, measuring the cottonwood stand, understanding which trees were worth cutting and which would fall on their own before spring. I had rebuilt the fire in the stove and made it draw properly by adjusting the stovepipe angle 2 degrees east. I had rechinked the worst of the wall gaps with river clay that I packed in with my fingers and let dry hard. I had read the notebooks through twice front to back and then again from the beginning with the carpenter's rule in my hand and the diagrams open beside me. I understood the system completely in theory, but theory and a November freeze are 2 different things. I managed to stack a partial wood wall against the north face before the first hard cold came down. 3 courses of split cottonwood, split side inward floor runners, salvaged from 2 planks I pried from the collapsed corner of the lean-to outside. It was not enough. The east wall was untouched. The west wall was untouched. The south wall, which Dory had written, was the most forgiving because it faced the cottonwood stand and caught less wind, had nothing. The cabin still leaked heat from every direction except one. By December, frost feathered the inside of the wash basin every morning. My breath made clouds that hung in the air until the stove caught up. The floor by the east wall was cold enough that I stopped walking on it without my boots on. I lost 15 pounds I didn't have to lose. My hip bones pressed against the mattress hard enough to leave bruises that didn't fade. My hands cracked at the knuckles and bled into my mittens. Every night I thought about the 9-mile road back to Medora, the warmth of Mrs. Peck's kitchen, a roof that didn't breathe cold air, food that didn't require an axe and a trap. Every night I thought about it, and every night something held me where I was not courage, not stubbornness, not any quality I had decided in advance to possess. Something quieter, something that felt less like resolve and more like gravity. What stopped me in the end was a line in the notebook marked 9th cold. I read it at 3 in the morning with my teeth chattering and my hands too cold to hold the lantern steady. Do not burn all your safety at once. Some fuel belongs in the wall before it belongs in the stove. Dory had written that after a 3-day blizzard when she had burned through half her wood supply in a single night, trying to keep warm. She had realized in the way that people realize things when survival is the teacher that burning faster was not the answer. Keeping the heat longer was. I lay on the bed in the dark with that line running through me and the cold pressing in from 3 directions, and I felt the full shape of the problem for the first time, not as an idea, but as a physical fact I was living inside. I was not cold because I didn't have enough firewood. I was cold because the cabin was bleeding heat faster than any stove could replace it. Every cord I burned was fighting the wind instead of warming me. The fire was engaged in a battle it could not win because the walls had already surrendered, and no amount of fuel changes the outcome of a war fought on that terrain. The answer was not more fire. The answer was better walls. And the walls and the fuel were the same thing, which meant the answer had been standing outside in the cottonwood stand, all along waiting to be understood in the right order. I got up before dawn. I put on every piece of clothing I owned. I went out into the dark and started swinging the axe. Spring was a long way off. But I had the notebooks, I had the wood, I had the land. And for the first time in my life, I had something that belonged to me, not borrowed, not temporary, not extended by someone who could withdraw it when I stopped being useful. This rotting room in a dead-end drawer was mine. And I was going to finish what Dory started. Spring came slow to the Badlands. It did not arrive the way spring arrives in gentler places all at once, green and soft and full of the smell of wet earth warming. It came in pieces, a week of thaw followed by a week of freeze, mud that sucked at your boots in the afternoon and turned to iron overnight, snow that melted from the south faces of the buttes and clung to the north faces until April. Then May, as if it had decided to make a point. But the cottonwoods came back. That was the thing about cottonwoods. You could look at them in February, crooked bark, split branches, stripped bare by 3 months of northwest wind, and believe completely that they were finished, that nothing living remained inside that gray and battered wood. And then one morning in late March, you would walk out into the draw, and there would be the faintest suggestion of green at the tips of the highest branches, tentative as a question, and you would understand that the tree had been alive all along. It had simply been waiting for the conditions to change. I understood that feeling personally. I had survived my first winter in the draw the same way the cottonwoods survived it, by going very still inside, by spending nothing I didn't have to spend, by waiting. I had come through thinner than I went in, cracked at the knuckles and bruised at the hip bones and down 15 pounds I had not had to spare. But I had come through. In the partial wall I had managed to build along the north face 3 uneven courses of split cottonwood floor runners, salvaged from a collapsed lean-to, stacked with more desperation than precision, had done exactly what Dory's notebook said it would do. The north side of the room had been survivable. The other 3 sides had been an education in everything still left to build. I started over in April. Not from nothing I kept the floor runners I had laid along the north wall because they were solid and correctly placed. But I tore down everything stacked on top of them and rebuilt it from the first course up this time, with Dory's measurements in my left hand and the carpenter's rule in my right. I had read the relevant sections of the notebooks so many times by then that the words were memorized without my trying to memorize them. They had simply worn grooves in my thinking, the way water wears grooves in stone. And when I picked up a piece of split cottonwood, I heard her voice before I heard my own. Split side inward, 16 to 20-inch lengths, every 4th course cross-laid for stability. I had found the cross-laying myself that first winter after my second stack collapsed onto the floor in the night and woke me out of a half-frozen sleep. Dory had not mentioned it in the notebooks, which meant either she had never thought of it or she had discovered it and died before she wrote it down. I chose to believe the latter. It felt like the kind of thing she would have known. I built the runners along the west wall, next cutting them from the straightest salvage lumber I could find in the collapsed shed a half-mile up the draw. The shed had been someone else's failure, a homesteader who had come out here before Dory tried to winter a small herd in a structure that was never going to hold against a Dakota January, and left everything behind when he gave up. The lumber was weathered and some of it was punky at the ends, but the center sections were sound. I cut away the bad parts and used what remained. By June, I had finished the north wall completely, floor to ceiling, 3 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly as it rose, because I had run out of the longer lengths and had to use what the cottonwood stand gave me. When I pressed my palm against the innermost course, the wood was room temperature, the same temperature as the air inside the cabin. When I reached through the gap between the stack and the old log wall and pressed my palm against the logs themselves, they were cold, even in the middle of a June afternoon. The system worked. 1 wall worked, 3 walls remained. I went to Medora for lamp oil and salt at the end of June. The road north was better in summer, dry enough to walk without losing your boots to the mud, though the clay dust coated everything and left a pale film on your skin and hair that took 3 washings to remove. 9 miles each way. I made the trip once a month when I could afford to and carried back what I needed in a canvas sack across my shoulders. Mrs. Nola Peck saw me at the mercantile counter. She came over with the particular tight smile of a woman who has been rehearsing something to say and is pleased to finally have the opportunity. Mrs. Peck was the kind of person who wore her opinions the way she wore her good dress put on for company, taken out specifically to be seen. "Heard you're still living in Dory's cabin," she said. "I am." Heard you're filling the room with firewood. All four walls. Working on it? She shook her head with the slow, mournful patience of someone watching a mistake being made that they are powerless to prevent. That woman was touched, you know. People said she meant to roast herself alive. People said she went strange from too many winters alone. She lowered her voice slightly, as if sharing something confidential. It's not natural filling up a room you live in with kindling. There's a name for what that is. I paid for my lamp oil and my salt. There is, I said. It's called insulation. Mrs. Peck stared at me the way people stare at a foreign language they did not expect to encounter. I picked up my canvas sack and walked out into the July heat and started the 9 miles back south with the sun on my shoulders and the names of Dory's trees running through my head, cottonwood box elder, the occasional dead elm that burned hot and fast and was worth the extra labor of felling. I had 3 walls left to build. I had the whole summer ahead of me. I went back to the draw and kept stacking. Ezra Cobb appeared on a Tuesday morning in late July, leading a rangy bay horse up the draw with a draw knife tucked under one arm and the expression of a man who has decided to be disappointed but hasn't fully committed to it yet. He was 72 years old. His chest had the slightly bowed look that comes from decades of freight work shoulders that had carried too much weight for too many years and had settled into that posture permanently. One white eyebrow grew longer than the other, which gave him a look of permanent skepticism that I later understood had nothing to do with skepticism and everything to do with genetics. He walked with a stiffness in his left hip that was worse on cold mornings and better by noon and worse again by evening, and he breathed with the careful, deliberate rhythm of a man who has learned that his lungs require management. He had been an Army teamster, then a carpenter, then a freighter out of Mandan who had spent 30 years hauling goods to places where goods did not want to stay. He knew the Badlands the way you know a difficult neighbor, not fondly but completely. He had also known Dory Rent. I came out of the cabin when I heard the horse. He stopped at the edge of the cottonwood stand and looked at me for a long moment without speaking. The bay horse dropped its head and found something worth investigating in the dry grass. "You're the Rent girl," he said. "Elsa Rent." He studied me the way a carpenter studies a joint before he decides whether it's worth saving, not unkindly but without sentiment. Then he gestured toward the stovepipe. "Your smoke is thin," he said. "Too thin for a bad stove in summer, which means your stove is drawing right." He paused. "Which means your room is holding heat." He said it the way you say a thing you already knew but needed to hear confirmed out loud. "It's holding on the north side," I said. "I've got 3 walls left." He tied the horse to a branch and walked toward the cabin. "Mind if I look?" I did mind in the way that you mind when someone asks to examine something you have made with your hands and your body and the last of your strength, and you are not yet sure if it is good enough to be seen. But I also needed someone to see it, someone who would understand what I was looking at, not just what I was doing. I stepped aside and let him in. He stood in the doorway for a full minute without speaking. He took in the north wall, the floor runners, the stacked courses, the cross laying at every 4th level, the gap between the wood and the old wall behind it. He walked to the wall and knocked on it with his knuckles. Hard testing knocks, the kind that tell a carpenter what he needs to know about what's behind a surface. He crouched down and looked at the floor runners and checked them for levelness with his eye. He stood back up and studied the ceiling cleats where the topmost courses pressed against the roof beam. Then he looked at me. "Dory was right," he said quietly. "She was just 20 years too early for people to bear being told." He had hauled lumber to the draw twice in the old years when Dory was still alive and still building. He had helped her reset the stove in the winter of 1876 when a wall stack had shifted in an early thaw and pulled the stovepipe out of alignment. He had played checkers at her table on 2 or 3 occasions when the road south was passable and he had nothing better to do with an afternoon. He had understood in the broad terms what she was attempting. He had not understood until he stood in my cabin and knocked on my wall and felt the difference in the wood that it had actually worked. He came back 3 days a week after that, sometimes 4 when his hip allowed it. Some mornings he arrived already tired, and I learned to read the difference between the days he could work and the days he could only watch and point. But every hour he gave me was worth a week of working alone because what he brought was not in Dory's notebooks. Dory had been a brilliant observer. She had measured everything measurable and recorded everything recordable, and drawn diagrams that were precise enough to build from. But she had worked alone for 22 winters, and there are things about wood and weight and the way a structure lives inside a season that you can only learn from someone who has built things in hard places and watched them fail, and rebuilt them and watched them fail again, and rebuilt them better the third time. Ezra taught me how to read the floor, not with instruments with my feet. Walk the room slowly every morning, he said. Feel for any spot that sounds different underfoot. A subtle give, a slight drum, a sound that is a fraction of a tone lower than the boards around it. That is where your runner is beginning to shift. That is where the weight is not distributed evenly. That is where you will lose a wall in a bad wind before you ever see it happening. He taught me how to check the wood itself, not just with my eyes, with my thumbnail. Press the nail into the end grain. If it goes in easy, the wood is beginning to rot from the inside out. If it resists cleanly, it is sound. He showed me which pieces in my north wall were already past their best and needed to be replaced before next winter, and he was right about every one of them. He taught me the safe distance between the stovepipe and the innermost course of stacked wood, not the minimum safe distance, but the comfortable safe distance, the one that leaves room for error and for the kind of drift a stovepipe develops over a hard winter when the temperature differential between inside and outside does things to the metal that were not planned for. He also taught me things that had nothing to do with construction. His wife had died in childbirth on the plains 30 years before I was born. The baby had died too. He had buried them both in a single grave near Fort Rice and had not remarried and had not spoken of them often. But occasionally in the late afternoons when the work was going well and the light was good and there was no particular reason to stay quiet, he would say something about her. Not grief exactly, more like acknowledgement. The way you acknowledge a landmark that has been part of your navigation for so long that pointing it out is simply accurate rather than sorrowful. The plains take, he told me one afternoon watching me split cottonwood with the particular efficiency that comes from 2 seasons of doing nothing else. That's what they do. The question is whether you take back. He said it without self-pity, just as fact. The same flat, useful tone I had started using when I talked about the cousin in Bismarck, about the farming family, about Mrs. Peck, and the boarding house, and the years of being passed between people like something nobody wanted to claim ownership of. We understood each other in that particular way that people understand each other when they have both lost things and decided to keep moving anyway. The summer of 1885 was when Silas Drum decided to pay attention. I had finished the west wall by the end of July. The east wall was half done, the lower courses were in, and solid, the upper courses were progressing 1 day's labor at a time. The south wall had its runners and the first 2 courses. By October, if the weather held and my axe head didn't crack and my body continued to function at something close to its current level, I would have all 4 walls finished before the first hard freeze. I was in Medora buying a new file for the axe when Drum found me. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders in the way of someone who had done physical labor for 20 years, and then stopped doing it and kept the width without keeping the condition. His beard was thick enough to hide most of his expression, but his eyes didn't hide any of it. He had the look of a man who was accustomed to being the largest concern in a room and who had decided somewhere along the way that this was simply the natural order of things. He owned the largest freight barn and wood yard in Medora. He sold hauled wood at prices that reflected the distance it traveled and the difficulty of the route, and more significantly, the fact that in a hard winter, there was no competition. He rented floor space in his shelter barn during storms $2 a night, straw bedding the warmth of other people's bodies in a room with a single cast iron stove. Families who could not afford his wood bought what they could and burned through it too fast and ended up renting floor space in his barn, which meant that Drum profited from the cold once when it started and once when it got bad enough. It was a good business model as long as nobody figured out a better way to stay warm. Miss Rent, he said, my name the way you say the name of something that has become inconvenient. Mr. Drum, I hear you've been telling people to fill their houses with firewood. I've been telling people how to stay warm. He stepped slightly closer, not close enough to be threatening, close enough to make the calculation visible. You keep advising fools to pile fuel in their living rooms, and one of them burns alive. I'll see your claim taken for public danger. A 16-year-old girl with no title experience and no standing in this community is not a hard person to dispossess. I was not 16 anymore. I was 18. I did not correct him. Then tell the truth when you speak of it, I said. The method doesn't increase fire risk. It reduces heat loss. The wood isn't loose in the room, it's stacked against the walls with a clear lane to the stove. Any literate person can understand the difference. Truth, Drum said, with a particular flatness, is what people pay to hear in winter. The truth is that your wood yard sells firewood at twice what it costs to cut it yourself. The truth is that your shelter barn charges families $2 a night to sleep on straw. The truth is that people die in bad winters because they cannot afford what you're selling. And the truth is that a system which lets a family stay warm in their own home on a third of the wood they currently burn is a threat to that arrangement. His face did not change. His eyes did. Careful, Miss Rent. You're one girl in a shack 9 miles from town. Things happen to people who live that far from help. He walked away before I could answer. I walked back to the draw 9 miles in the afternoon light, and I thought about what Ezra had told me. The frontier trusts what it sees. It believes results. When this room keeps you alive through something that kills the unprepared, they'll understand. Not before. I did not have results yet. I had one finished wall, one nearly finished, two still in progress. I needed to finish. That night I read through the 8th notebook by lamplight, looking for anything about Dory's history with Silas Drum, because the name SD had appeared in her margins more than once and I had passed over it without stopping. Now I stopped. July 1879. SD came to the draw with an offer, $40 for the full design and the notebooks. Said he wanted to license it to homesteaders at cost. I do not believe this is what he wants it for. I declined. He was polite about it in the way that men are polite about things they intend to pursue differently later. September 1879. Filed complaint with county clerk, claim cited as fire hazard, citing my interior wood storage as evidence of dangerous practice. Complaint was dismissed after I provided documentation of my temperature measurements. The process cost me 6 months. October 1879. SD at the Mercantile. Did not speak to me directly. Spoke to 3 men near the freight counter within my hearing about the strange woman in the draw who would burn herself alive one winter and save the county the trouble of dealing with her. I closed the notebook. Drum had tried to buy Dory's work. When she refused, he had tried to destroy her credibility. When that failed, he had waited. He had outlasted her not by doing anything else, just by waiting. And now, 6 years after her last notebook entry, he was trying the same sequence with me. The same man, the same tactics, the same patience of someone who understood that time was usually on the side of whoever held the resources. He was not going to outlast me. I got up at 4 in the morning and went out to the cottonwood stand with the axe. The winter of 1885 into 1886 was the first winter I spent inside a room that functioned. Not perfectly, I had 3 walls finished and one still partial, and partial was not the same as complete. But the difference between 3 walls and 1 wall was not incremental. It was the difference between a system that was working and a system that was struggling, and I lived inside that difference every morning when I measured the temperatures and recorded the numbers in my own notebook, the one I had bought in Medora, and begun filling in the same small, precise hand that Dora used, because by then, her handwriting had shaped mine without my choosing. North wall floor temperature, at dawn, 34 degrees. Outside temperature, 14 below. Wood burned in 24 hours, 1/4 cord. The previous winter, before any walls were finished, I had burned nearly a full cord in the same span and woken with frost on the blankets. The numbers were not a matter of opinion. They were a record, and they told the same story every morning. The system worked, but the south wall was still unfinished, and the south wall mattered. The setback came in March of 1886. February had been too warm, not warm like spring, warm like a lie. The temperature rose 40 degrees in 2 days. The snow on the buttes ran off in sheets. The creek bed that was dry from October to April ran briefly, which had not happened in the 3 winters I had been in the draw. The air was wet and strange and wrong in the particular way that February air in the Badlands is never supposed to be. I woke on the 3rd morning of the warm spell to a sound I had not heard before. A slow, soft settling like a deck of cards being squared. Then silence. Then the sound again. I lit the lantern. The south wall, the newest wall, The one I had only recently finished the lower courses of was leaning outward, not catastrophically, not yet. A 10-degree list toward the door. Outer courses having absorbed moisture from 2 days of wet air and expanded and shifted on the floor runners in the night. 8 courses of split cottonwood, some of the best wood I had cut on all winter, standing at an angle that told me clearly they would be on the floor before noon if I touched them wrong. I spent the entire day restacking. Angry, frightened, and alone, the way you are when something you have built with your hands and your back, and months of your life threatens to come apart before you have had the chance to prove it works. I pulled each course down carefully and reset it. I checked the floor runners for level and shimmied 2 of them with flat stones I brought in from the creek bed. I added the willow lashing that Ezra had shown me how to tie, looping it through ceiling cleats. I drove myself crossing it over the face of the stack, at intervals binding the whole structure to the room rather than just sitting in it. Then I added the upright slats at the corners, where the stacks met at right angles and were most vulnerable to lateral movement. When I finished, the wall was not just stacked wood anymore. It was a wall. It was integral with the room, part of the structure, something you would have to deliberately dismantle to remove, rather than something that the weather could persuade to come apart on its own. I sat down on the floor next to the finished wall and looked at it in the lamplight. Then I reached between the floor runner and the bottom plank in the space where the runner met the north wall, at the corner, the space I had cleaned out and rebuilt. First, the space I knew better than any other part of the floor. I was checking for any moisture that might have crept in under the runners during the warm spell. My fingers found a fold of paper. I had checked this corner before. I had cleaned it out when I rebuilt the runners in the second spring. But the paper was tucked tight against the underside of the lowest plank, held in place by the weight of the stack above it, not hidden exactly, but placed. Deliberately placed in a location that would only be found by someone who had taken everything apart and put it back together more than once. I unfolded it in the lamplight. Dory's handwriting, small and careful and exact, the same as the notebooks. If you are reading this, you found the box. You came here and you looked and you found it. That means you are the one she wrote to. She was bookish and stubborn. Those were the words I used in the letters, and I meant them as the highest compliment I knew. The valley will need this before they know they need it. The winters that are coming are not the winters that have been. I have watched the signs for 3 years, and I know what they mean, and I will not be here to see it. Don't wait for them to ask. They will not ask until it is too late. Build it first. Prove it first. Then when the cold comes for them, you will have something to give. She had known. Not just that someone would come, that I would come. She had written the letters, and she had known those letters might not reach me, and she had left this second message in a place that only someone who had taken the whole system apart and rebuilt it would ever find. She had built a redundancy into her own farewell. The way she built redundancy into the walls, because a system that depends on one thing working perfectly is not a system, it is a wish. I sat on the floor of the cabin with her note in my hands, and the March wind picking up outside, and the walls holding, and the stove burning steady, and I understood what she had been doing for 22 winters. Not surviving, preparing for a winter she knew she would not live to see, preparing for the valley. Preparing for me, though. She did not know my name when she started, though she had to guess at who I would be, and trust that whoever came would be stubborn enough and bookish enough to finish what she had started. I folded the note and kept it in the same canvas, square she had wrapped the letters in, tucked into the inside pocket of my coat, where I kept things I needed to be sure of. Then I went back to work. Through the summer and fall of 1886, I completed the east wall and brought the south wall up to full height. Through 1887, I finished the south wall completely, the last 2 courses requiring lumber I had to fell and split from trees. I had been saving older cottonwood that had grown straighter than most and dried harder and would burn longer when the time came. By November of 1887, all 4 walls were finished. The room was 8 feet square inside the stacking. It was not a comfortable space to live in. The aisle from the door to the bed was barely wide enough for 2 people walking single file. Everything I owned fit on 2 shelves above the sleeping platform. The ceiling cleats held every stack plumb against seasonal moisture changes. The willow lashing at the corners had been replaced once when the original strands began to fray, replaced with heavier lashing that I had braided myself from green willow in the spring. The floor runners were level and solid shimmed where necessary, checked weekly for soft spots the way Ezra had taught me. I had 3 full cords of seasoned wood stacked in the walls, and another cord and a half in the outdoor shed I had built that summer, slatted walls to let the air circulate, roof pitched to shed snow, the whole thing oriented, so the prevailing wind pulled moisture out rather than pushing it in. Dory had not mentioned a drying shed in the notebooks. I had designed it myself from first principles, and from the things Ezra had told me about how wood needed to breathe. Ezra came on a Tuesday in late November to look at the finished walls. He moved through the cabin, slowly checking each wall in turn, the knuckle test, the thumbnail test, the eye level check for plumb. He looked at the outdoor shed. He checked the stovepipe clearances one more time and then added, "You're past where Dory got," he said. "She never finished all 4 walls." "She did the hard part," I said. "She figured it out. I just followed the instructions." He shook his head with the patience of someone who has watched people give credit in the wrong direction for a long time. "Following instructions is easy when they work the first time. You made them work in conditions she never tested. That's not following instructions. That's engineering." He left before dark, walking carefully on the frozen track, his breath making steady clouds in the cold air. I watched him until he reached the top of the draw and disappeared over the ridge. The sky in the northwest was clear and dark and full of stars. I went inside. I checked the fire. I pressed my palm against the innermost course of the north wall and felt the wood at room temperature, dry and solid, holding everything it was supposed to hold. Outside, the temperature was dropping through 0. Inside, the stove burned steady and the walls held still, and the room was warm. I sat down on the bed and opened the newest notebook to a clean page and wrote the date at the top. November 14th, 1887. 4 walls complete. System operational. Then I put down the pen and sat in the warmth and listened to the cottonwoods outside begin their evening sound, that low, dry, persistent whisper that I had learned over 4 years to hear, not as a threat but as information. The northwest sky was clear. The temperature was falling. Something was coming. I did not know yet how big it would be. I did not know yet what it would cost or what it would prove or who it would reach. I only knew that the walls were finished and the wood was seasoned, and the system that Dory Rent had spent 22 winters building was finally completely ready to be tested. I turned down the lamp. I lay in the dark and listened to the wind picking up in the cottonwoods. And I waited. The sky on January 12, 1888 was the color of a lie, soft and pale and almost warm, with a thin winter sun that had no business being that gentle in the middle of a Dakota January. The snow on the south faces of the buttes had softened overnight. The track up from the draw was running a thin trickle of meltwater along its center groove. The cottonwoods stood in that loose, slightly confused posture that trees adopt when the temperature does something unexpected, neither fully dormant nor fully awake. In Medora, 9 miles north, people opened their windows. I know this because Mrs. Nola Peck told me later, with the particular shame of someone confessing a mistake they cannot undo. She had opened the front windows of the boarding house at 10 in the morning to let the air move through. 2 of the ranch hands who boarded with her had ridden out without scarves. Children had played in the yard without coats, their mothers watching from the doorways with expressions of cautious pleasure, the kind that comes when a hard season seems to be relenting earlier than expected. People talked about an early spring. I did not talk about an early spring. Ezra Cobb had a barometer. He had carried it since his Army days, a brass instrument in a fitted wooden case, the kind of thing that followed a man through 30 years of freight work in 2 territories, because it was useful and because useful things earn the right to be kept. He had it on the shelf in his room at the boarding house in Medora, and he checked it the way old habits get checked automatically without ceremony, the same way you check a wound you have been tending long enough to read without thinking. At noon on January 12th, it read normally. At 3 in the afternoon, it had dropped 1 point. At 6 in the evening, it had dropped 2 more. He came to the draw in the last of the light, walking fast for a man with a bad hip leading the bay horse, because riding was harder on his lungs than walking. I was outside checking the shed when I heard him coming up the track. The sound of his boots on the frozen clay was different than usual, quicker, with less of the deliberate economy he normally brought to movement. He did not say anything when he reached me. He looked at the northwest horizon for a long moment. The sky there had gone a color I had no name for. Not quite gray, not quite green, not quite the flat white of an ordinary overcast. It was the color of something dense and cold and very large moving toward us from a great distance at a speed that had not yet become apparent. The cottonwoods had gone completely still, not the stillness of a calm evening, the stillness of held breath. "It's coming," Ezra said. "I know it's going to be bad. I know." He looked at the cabin, at the stovepipe which was drawing clean and thin in the cold air, at the outdoor shed packed to the rafters with seasoned wood, at the door, which I had rehung in October so that it fit its frame properly and sealed against the weather the way a door was supposed to seal. "You're ready," he said. "Most people aren't." He turned and walked back up the track toward Medora before full dark. I watched him until the draw swallowed the sound of his boots. Then I went inside, built the fire up to a steady burn, checked every wall with my palms, and lay down in my clothes to wait. The temperature started falling before midnight. By the time the darkness outside the greased paper window began to gray toward morning, it was below zero. By full light, it was 30 below, and the wind had arrived not gradually, not as a building pressure, but all at once as if something enormous had been holding it back and simply let go. It came from the northwest in gusts that hit the cabin like something solid. Not air, something with mass and intention. The walls creaked and the stovepipe sang a high, thin note on the worst of the gusts, and the door shuddered in its frame with each new assault. Outside, the cottonwoods were suffering in a way that trees are not supposed to suffer, not bending, because the cold had made them rigid, but cracking. Branch by branch, a sound like distant rifle fire, steady and without pause, carrying through the storm from the stand below the draw. I lay in the dark and waited for the cold to come through the walls. It did not come. The stove was burning at the same steady rate it had burned all autumn. Not straining, not consuming wood faster than the heat it produced was worth just running clean and consistent, the way a well-fed fire runs when it does not have to fight for every degree it produces. The room was cool near the floor, but not cold. The north wall, which in my first winter had been the place where frost formed on the inside of the logs, by December was merely cool to the touch. The floor under my boots was solid and dry. I got up and lit the candle. I pressed my palm against the innermost course of the north wall. Faint chill, dry. The wood itself was giving nothing back to the cold outside because it had nothing to give. It was insulating, not conducting, holding the boundary between inside and outside, the way a boundary is supposed to hold. I pried up the loose plank I had left near the floor for exactly this purpose and looked into the gap between the innermost stack and the old log wall behind it. White rime, frost thick as paint crusted on the old logs where the cold had pushed through from outside. It had crossed the log wall. It had entered the dead air space, and there it had stopped. The gap held still air, and the still air held the line, and on the inner side of that line, the wood of my stack was completely, entirely dry. The system worked, not in theory, not on paper, not in Dory's careful measurements from 20 years ago in conditions I had not been present for. It worked right now in the worst cold I had ever experienced, in a storm that was cracking the branches off the cottonwoods outside and driving the temperature down through numbers that stopped meaning anything to the body and started meaning something else entirely. I stood in the center of that room, the walls pressing close on every side, the stove burning at the heart of it, the whole small space holding itself against whatever came next, and I did something I had not done in a very long time. I laughed. Then I sat down on the floor with my face in my hands and I cried. Not from grief, not from fear, from the kind of relief that lives below all the other feelings and only surfaces when the thing you have been holding your breath about for years finally resolves itself into something certain. Dory had been right. The thing everyone had called crazy had worked. The joke had kept me alive. I sat there for a while on the floor of the cabin that had been a joke, in the warmth that should not have existed, and I let myself feel it completely. Then I heard what was happening in Medora. Not directly, the wind was too loud and the draw was too far. But I heard it later, piece by piece, from the people who lived it and came to me afterward with the particular look of people who have survived something they did not expect to survive and are still not entirely sure how. The wells froze on the first day. Not the deep ones, not yet, but the shallow hand pumps that most families depended on for daily water. Ice formed in the pipes and would not clear no matter what was poured down them. Families melted snow in cook pots and burned through their wood supplies, doing it because melting enough snow to produce a useful quantity of water requires a sustained heat that an already struggling stove can barely provide. The livestock went on the second day. Cattle that had been left in inadequate barns, barns that were never built for 40 below, that were built for the average Dakota winter, and not for the one that arrives once in a generation, froze where they stood. Not quickly. The cold in a barn that is losing heat builds from the outside in, and the animals move toward the center, and the center gets colder too, and eventually there is nowhere left to move. The Holbrook family lost their milk cow on the second morning. They found her standing in the corner of the barn with her legs locked and her eyes open, which was in some ways worse than finding her down. Mrs. Peck's boarding house began failing on the night of the second day. The woodpile at the back of the house had drifted over, not buried, but obscured enough that the back door had to be forced open against the packed snow, and every time it was forced open, the kitchen lost heat faster than the stove could replace it. By midnight, the kitchen temperature had dropped below freezing. She moved everyone into the main room. 8 boarders, 2 children who belonged to a family passing through herself, and hung blankets over the windows, and pushed the iron stove as hard as she dared, and it was not enough. The temperature inside Mrs. Peck's boarding house dropped below zero on the third night. The Holbrook family was worse. Their saw-roofed, lean-to addition, the room where the 3 youngest children slept, had never been properly sealed, where it joined the main structure. The northwest wind found that gap and reversed the draft in the stove, filling the room with smoke and forcing a choice that no family should have to make: suffocation or freezing. They chose freezing. They pulled the children into the main room and piled every blanket and coat and piece of spare clothing they owned over the bed, where all 5 of them lay together and prayed for the wind to change. Silas Drum had wood. He had plenty of wood. His freight barn had been stacked full since October because Drum understood the business of winter well enough to be prepared for it. His shelter barn was warm, and his wood supply was deep, and he was charging $2 a night for floor space, and the floor was full. Families who could not pay slept in their failing houses and burned the last of what they had and got colder. On the third day, I held the thermometer outside the window for 5 minutes and pulled it back in and read it in the candlelight. 47 below zero. I stood in the center of my room and measured the floor temperature near the stove. 51 above. 98 degrees of difference across 3 feet of stacked cottonwood and dead air. I sat down on the bed and looked at the walls, at Dory's system, which I had spent 4 years completing, at the wood that had been a joke and was now the reason I was alive and warm while the territory froze around me. I thought about what she had written in the 12th notebook, the line that had stopped me cold the first time I read it and had not stopped being true since. What saves you in a hard country is often the thing people laugh at before they understand it. She had built for this. The winters that are coming are not the winters that have been. And now I had to decide what to do with it. That was when Ezra collapsed. He had been in Medora when the storm hit too far from the draw to reach me safely close enough to the boarding house to be useful. He had spent the first 2 days helping Mrs. Peck manage the stove and calm the boarders and think through what resources remained. But on the 4th day, with the temperature still at 40 below, and the boarding house holding at barely survivable levels, a child had needed moving. She was 5 years old. The daughter of the family passing through the ones who had not planned to be in Medora in January and had no adequate winter gear for their children. She had developed the gray-white patches on her cheeks and fingers that meant the cold was winning, and Mrs. Peck's boarding house was not warm enough to turn that around. And Ezra knew where the warmest room in 40 miles was. He wrapped the child in every blanket Mrs. Peck could spare. He carried her up the track from Medora toward the draw 9 miles through a storm that had been killing the unprepared for 4 days. He was 72 years old with bad lungs and a left hip that seized in cold weather and no business being outside in 40 below zero. He made it to my door. He knocked twice. I heard it through the wind, and when I opened the door, he was standing in the frame with the bundled child held against his chest and snow crusted so thick on his coat and hat that for a moment I did not recognize him. He put the child in my arms. He said something I couldn't hear over the wind. Then his legs simply stopped working, and he went down. I got him inside. I got him onto the bed with the child between us for shared warmth. I piled every blanket I had onto both of them and stoked the fire and held a tin cup of warm water to his lips and waited. His breathing was the sound of a bellows with a hole in it. After a while, he opened his eyes. "The system works," he said. His voice was barely a whisper breath, in consonants, almost no voice behind it. "Tell them. You'll tell them yourself," I said. He looked at me with the patient expression of someone who has made peace with a fact that the other person has not yet accepted. "I've seen what I needed to see," he said. I did not argue. I held the cup steady and let him drink and watched the child's colors slowly return to something living, and I felt the full weight of what Ezra had done settle into the room alongside the warmth. He had walked 9 miles through 40 below cold with bad lungs and a bad hip because a child needed to be somewhere warm. He had done it because he was the kind of man who did what needed doing when he understood what needed doing, and he had understood this completely. I looked at the walls he had helped me build, at the wood that had been a joke, at the room that was warm while everything outside was dying. Then I put on my coat. Before I reached the door, I stopped. I went to the shelf where I kept the oilcloth-wrapped canvas square. I took out Dory's carpenter's rule, the one with the pencil measurements along the wooden edge, the distances and heights she had marked herself over 22 winters. I held it for a moment the way you hold something that connects you to a person you never met but know completely. Then I saw the bundle of letters underneath it. I picked them up, turned the top one over. Read the address in Dory's careful handwriting for what must have been the 100th time since I had found them. Miss Elsa Rent, care of Mrs. Ida Holt. Episcopal Girls' Home, Jamestown, Dakota Territory. And this time standing in a warm room at 47 below zero, with an old man breathing carefully on my bed, and a child sleeping beside him, and the storm pressing against four walls that were holding everything it had this time, I let myself understand it completely. Not partially, not at a careful distance, the way I had been processing it for 4 years, taking it in pieces, because the whole of it was too much to hold at once. Mrs. Ida Holt had received these letters. She had read them. She had to have read them because the probate envelope had contained Dory's note about the third plank, which meant she opened correspondence carefully enough to find additional documents inside. She had read 7 letters from a dying woman asking for a specific child by name, explaining what she was trying to pass on, asking for the chance to give it to someone who could use it. She had read every one of them. And then she had stood in the back room of Holt and Mercer Mercantile and read the will out loud in a flat, precise voice and waited for the laughter, and she had let 11 people laugh at the thing a dead woman had left me, knowing the whole time that Dory had been trying to reach me for the last year of her life. It had not been an oversight. It had been a choice. I stood with the letters in my hand for 30 seconds. The wind hit the north wall with a sound like a fist. The stove burned steady. Ezra breathed his careful, compromised breaths on the bed behind me. I put the letters down. I put on my coat. I picked up Dory's carpenter's rule and put it in my pocket, not because I needed it for measurement, but because I wanted something of hers in my hands for what came next. And I walked out into 47 below zero to teach people who had laughed at me how not to die. Mrs. Nola Peck came to my door first. She arrived on the 5th day, wrapped in a blanket over her coat, with her face raw and red from wind exposure, and her jaw set in the particular expression of a woman who has decided to do something that cost her something and has decided to pay it. She stood at the door and looked at me with eyes that had the exhausted, stripped-down quality of someone who has spent 4 days being wrong about something that mattered. She did not ask for charity. She asked for instruction. There was a difference, and she knew it, and she needed me to know she knew it. "I can't keep the house warm," she said. "Tell me what to do." I did not make her beg. I did not remind her of what she had said about Dory. I did not mention the conversation at the mercantile counter or the smile she had aimed at me from across the room when Mrs. Holt read the will. "Bring your north wall wood in first," I said. "Split side inward. Leave a lane clear to the stove 4 feet minimum. Come as close to the ceiling as the stack will hold. I'll come when Ezra is sleeping." She looked at me for a moment with an expression I had not seen on her face before. It was not gratitude exactly. It was the look of someone recalibrating, adjusting an internal measurement that had been wrong for long enough that correcting it required some visible effort. Then she left, and 2 hours later, she came back with 2 men and a sledge loaded with the wood from her back pile, dug out from under 4 days of packed snow. I walked to the boarding house through cold that burned the inside of my nose with every breath and froze my eyelashes together if I let them stay closed too long. The boarding house was dying in the specific way that buildings die in extreme cold, not collapsing, but surrendering, giving up degree by degree, the warmth inside bleeding out through every gap and crack, while the stove consumed wood faster than the heat it produced could justify. I showed them what to do. Start with the worst wall, I said. Stack split side inward. Leave a hand-width gap between the wood and the log wall behind it. That gap is the work. That gap is what holds the still air that holds the heat. Do not fill it. Do not stuff it. Leave it. They stacked. I supervised. I moved their hands to the right positions the way Ezra had moved mine, not correcting from a distance, but getting close enough to show exactly what I meant. By afternoon, one wall was done. By evening, two. By the following morning, the boarding house was holding heat. Not perfectly, it was not four walls, it was two and two walls against a storm. Like this one, it was not a complete solution. But it was the difference between surviving and not surviving, and that difference was measurable and real, and everybody in the room could feel it. Word moved the way word moves in a small community, under pressure, not through announcement, but through the particular efficiency of people who need something badly enough to tell each other about it without being asked. The Holbrook family came next. They had no wood left. They had burned everything they had in the first 3 days, and then burned the extra they had borrowed from a neighbor, and then burned pieces of a broken chair and the lumber from the lean-to addition they had already abandoned. I sent 2 men with axes to cut deadfall from draw the downed cottonwood and box elder that I had been leaving as future stock, the fallen trees that were already seasoned by lying on the ground through 2 winters. They dragged it back on sledges through the storm, and we stacked it against the Holbrook west wall while the 3 youngest children watched from the doorway with faces that had the particular stillness of children who have been frightened enough to stop making noise. The school teacher came. Then 2 freighters from Drum's barn who had heard about the boarding house from their wives, who had heard from the women who had been there. Then the families who had laughed. I gave to the Peterson family, who had kept me for 4 months when I was 14 and put me out when I corrected Mr. Peterson's seat accounts at the supper table. I gave to the Arden family, whose eldest son had been one of the 3 ranch hands sitting on the flour barrels in the probate room. I gave to a woman who had once told Mrs. Peck, within my hearing, that the strange girl in the draw was going to burn herself alive before spring. I gave to all of them, not because I had forgotten. I had not forgotten. I carried the specific memory of every one of those moments, the way you carry a scar, not constantly present, but there when you press on, it's still shaped exactly like what made it. I gave because Dory had built the system for the valley. She had written it in the note under the floor runner. The valley will need this before they know they need it. She had not built it for the people who deserved it. She had built it for the people who needed it. Those were not always the same people, and she had known that, and she had built it anyway. Ezra watched from the bed on the evenings when I came back to check on him and the child. He was not getting better. His breathing had the quality of something working very hard to maintain a level. It could no longer comfortably maintain, but he was stable, and the child was well, and the room was warm. "They don't deserve it," he said one evening, after I described giving my best seasoned box elder to a family that had laughed at both Dory and me. I was exhausted in a way that went past the body and into something deeper. My hands were cracked at every knuckle. My throat burned from breathing frozen air all day. My legs had the weighted feeling of having asked too much of them for too many consecutive days. "Maybe not," I said, "but the cold doesn't care who was cruel, and I won't learn cruelty from weather." Ezra was quiet for a long time. The stove burned, the wind worked at the walls and found nothing to work with. "Dory would have been proud of you," he said. I didn't answer. I just checked the fire and turned down the lamp and let him sleep. Silas Drum came on the 9th day. He did not come to apologize. I understood that before he arrived, men like Drum do not apologize because apologizing requires acknowledging a kind of wrongness that threatens the architecture of how they understand themselves, and that architecture is more important to them than accuracy. He came because public opinion had shifted in the particular way it shifts when a crisis makes visible what was previously deniable. And even Drum could feel the change in how people looked at him and how they looked at me. He could feel it in the mercantile, in the way conversations adjusted when he entered a room, in the small recalibrations of posture and eye contact that tell a man who has always read rooms carefully that the room has changed. A wagon of cottonwood arrived at the top of the draw in the afternoon. I heard it from inside the cabin, the creak of the loaded bed, the sound of the horse on the frozen track. I went outside and watched from the doorway. The wagon stopped. Two men unloaded the wood and stacked it beside the outdoor shed without being asked to do so in any particular way. Drum sat on the bench and did not look in my direction. When the wood was stacked, the men climbed back up and the wagon turned and went back up the track toward Medora. No note, no acknowledgement, no apology. I heard later what he had said to someone in town when asked about it. A bad idea that happened to outlive the storm. He never admitted he was wrong. He never threatened me again either. In the calculus of men like Drum, that was as close to concession as the architecture allowed. I stacked his cottonwood in the shed alongside mine and did not say anything about it to anyone. The storm ended on the 12th day. It did not end dramatically. It ended the way hard things end when they have run their full course, not with a reversal, but with an exhaustion. The wind dropped first from gusts that shook the door in its frame to a steady pressure, to an ordinary winter wind, to nothing. The temperature rose slowly 1 degree at a time over 2 days until it was merely very cold rather than lethally cold. 4 people in Medora died in those 12 days. 2 from exposure, a man who had tried to reach his barn in the worst of it and been found 50 feet from his back door, and an elderly woman who had been alone in a house with a failed stove and no one checking on her. 1 from a stove fire, which was the thing Drum had warned about, and which happened because the family had stacked wood too close to the firebox without leaving the proper lane in a cabin I had not reached in time. 1 from a heart attack while shoveling snow on the 13th day, which was not the storm's fault in the direct sense and was in every other sense entirely the storm's fault. 4 people. In a storm that the territorial papers would later call the worst cold event in 50 years. In a storm that killed cattle by the thousands and froze wells solid and broke the branches off trees that had stood for a generation. In a town of 200 people with inadequate shelter and inadequate wood supplies in a winter that arrived without warning on a morning when everyone had opened their windows to let in the air. 4 people. I thought about that number for a long time. I thought about what it would have been without the boarding house walls and the Holbrook West Wall and the families who had learned in the middle of the crisis what Dory had tried to teach the Valley for 22 years. I thought about it the way you think about a calculation whose answer matters too much to say out loud. I did not say it out loud to anyone. It was not the kind of thing you said. It was the kind of thing you carried quietly and let it change the shape of what you did next. Mrs. Ida Holt came in March. The snow had pulled back from the roads enough for travel, though the draws were still deep and the track south was mud that sucked at the wheels of the hired sleigh she arrived in. I was outside checking the outdoor shed when I heard her coming. I watched her climb down from the sleigh in her black bombazine dress, the same dress I was almost certain that she had worn in the probate room 3 years ago, carrying a tin document box wrapped in a shawl against the cold. She walked toward me through the mud with her boots sinking at each step and her face wearing the expression of a woman who has prepared carefully for a conversation she does not know how to begin. She stopped 3 feet away. "Miss Wrent," she said. "Mrs. Holt, may I come inside?" I could have refused. I had every right to refuse. I stood in the mud for a moment and thought about the 7 letters, about the years I had spent being passed between families who didn't want me, about the particular weight of knowing that someone had held the thing that could have changed all of it and had decided for reasons I still did not fully understand to hold it instead of pass it on. I stepped aside and let her in. She stood in the center of the room for a long time without speaking. She looked at the walls, at the blackened inner faces of the wood where I had burned course after course through 12 days of storm pulling fuel from the walls, in the careful sections Dory had prescribed, never exposing more than a few inches of the old log shell to the cold at any time. She looked at the floor runners, in the ceiling cleats, in the willow lashing, in the carpenter's rule hanging on its peg beside the door. She looked at everything Dory had designed and I had built and the winter had tested. Her jaw, which I had never seen fully unclenched, was unclenched now. Whatever she had come prepared to say, the room had taken part of it from her before she could begin. Then she opened the tin box. Inside were the letters, all 7 of them. Dory's handwriting on the envelope, slightly faded now from 3 years in a tin box, but legible, careful, exact. These arrived beginning in the spring of 1881, Mrs. Holt said. Your aunt wrote twice asking for you. She described you bookish and stubborn, were her words. She wanted to mentor you. She wanted to give you the claim and the notebooks and everything she had spent 22 years learning. She held the letters out. I took them. I didn't forward them, she said, because I decided that giving a dying woman's experiments and a failed land claim to a half-grown orphan was another form of negligence. I told myself I was protecting you from false hope. She paused. The pause had the quality of something that had been rehearsed and was now departing from the script. I was wrong about what false hope looks like. I was wrong about what protection looks like. I was wrong about what a girl with nothing to lose and everything to learn is capable of. The room was quiet. The stove burned. Outside, the meltwater from the March thaw moved along the creek bed in a thin, persistent trickle, the first water sound I had heard from that direction since October. I looked at the letters in my hands, at Dory's handwriting, at the address she had put there in the careful hope that they would reach me, and the certainty which I could feel in the precision of the script, in the way every letter of my name was formed with the same deliberate care as the notebook entries that she was not sure they would. I felt the weight of everything that had been taken. The years at the girls' home that could have been spent here learning. The winters Dory had spent alone in this draw when she did not have to be alone. The connection that should have been made and wasn't because a woman in a black dress had made a decision about what a girl was worth and what a dead woman's work deserved. I felt all of it, and then I felt the warmth of the room, the walls Dory had designed, the system I had finished, the people who were alive in Medora because I had been here when the worst cold in 50 years came down from the north. I forgive you, I said. Mrs. Holt's eyes changed in a way I had not expected. Something that had been held in a fixed position for a long time shifted very slightly, and the shift was visible. I forgive you, I said again. Not because you were right to stop the letters. Not because I've forgotten it. I forgive you because I would rather keep this room warm than fill it with what should have been. She left an hour later. She did not cry in front of me, but her hands shook when she reached for the side of the sleigh to climb up, and she did not look back as the horse pulled her up the track toward the ridge. I stood in the doorway and watched until she was gone. Then I went back inside and sat down with Dory's letters in my lap and read every one of them from the beginning, slowly, the way you read something that was written for you and has finally arrived. Ezra died in September of 1888. I found him in the morning in Dory's old chair on the porch outside the cabin, the chair I had repaired in the second spring, replacing 2 broken rungs with sections of straight-grained ash I had cut for the purpose. He was sitting with one hand resting on a wooden peg gauge he had been making for wall spacing, a tool he had described to me 3 weeks earlier, and had been shaping slowly in the hours when the weather was mild enough to sit outside and the light was good enough to work by. A bowl of bean broth sat on the small table beside the chair. It had gone cold sometime in the night. His face was peaceful in the particular way of faces that have finished with effort. Not empty finished. The difference matters. I buried him on the rise above the draw on the high ground where you could see the cabin and the bend of the river and the full reach of the cottonwood stand below. The soil was hard even in September, and the digging took most of a day, and I did it alone because that was how Ezra would have wanted it done, not because no one would have helped, but because some work is the right size for one person and the wrong size for a crowd. I planted a ring of wild plum cuttings around the grave. He had told me once in the second summer, watching me work the soil of the kitchen garden I had started along the south face of the draw, that the Badlands deserved one pretty stubborn thing that came back every spring, whether the winter had been kind or not. Wild plum was the right answer. It bloomed early before anything else had the courage to, and the blossoms were white and small and smelled of something that had no business being in a place this hard, and was there anyway. He left me his carpentry chest, a sound mule, a folded paper naming me the owner of his small storage shed in Medora. The shed became my workshop. Dr. Aldous Fenn sent the circular east with a supply rider in the spring of 1888. He had drafted it himself in the plain language of a man accustomed to explaining things to people who needed to act on the information rather than simply admire it. He described the physics in terms that any literate person could follow: low thermal conductivity, Dead air spaces, the principle that fuel can shelter before it burns. He described the construction method in steps precise enough to replicate without my being present. He had wanted to post it at the Mercantile the previous October. Holt, when she heard about it in March, did not take it down. A territorial agricultural paper picked it up that summer. They ran it with a brief description of the 1888 storm and its outcomes in Medora. They called the method by the name I had given it when Dr. Fenn asked me what to call it. The Rent Interior Woodwall Method, Dory's name above mine. I had been clear about that with Dr. Fenn when he sat across from me at the table in my workshop and asked how he should attribute it. Her name above mine, I said, because she had done the work that made my work possible, and the order of names on a page is one of the few ways a living person can give a dead person what they are owed. He wrote it down exactly as I said it and did not suggest any alternative arrangement, which was one of the reasons I trusted him. I married at 26. His name was Daniel Reeve, a blacksmith from 40 miles east, who came to the draw in the autumn of 1893 to fit new stoveplates in the demonstration cabin I had built adjacent to the original. He was the kind of man who looked at the walls before he looked at the stove because he understood that the stove was only as useful as what the walls let it do. He listened more than he talked. He worked with his hands in the way of someone who respects materials, not just their utility, but their nature, the way different woods move differently and different metals respond differently, to heat the particular honesty of things that do exactly what their properties require them to do. He understood, without my having to explain it why, I sometimes sat alone in the evenings with Dory's notebooks in my lap and did not speak. He understood it the way a man understands something he has recognized in himself, the need to return to the source of what you know, to hold the original thing and feel it still present and unchanged. We had 3 children. They grew up in a house with stacked wood on all 4 interior walls and thought this was the most ordinary thing in the world. They thought all houses were built this way. It was not until they were old enough to visit other families that they understood this was not the case, and by then the understanding of why it was better had already lived in their hands and their bodies for long enough to stay. They knew the feel of sound wood versus punky wood without being told to check. They knew by instinct to leave the gap. They knew that the wall came before the fire. Some things pass through the hands before they pass through the mind, and by the time the mind understands them, they are already permanent. I spent the next 30 years helping families winterize one-room houses across the territory. I wrote a practical booklet with Dr. Fenn that went through 4 printings and was eventually translated into German for the communities along the upper Missouri. People sent for me before hard winters, not after. My hands knew the wall system the way a piano player's hands know a piece they have played 10,000 times, not by thinking, by being, by the kind of knowledge that has gone past the mind and into the muscle and lives there without requiring maintenance. I aged into the work. My body showed it the way bodies show the work they have done, not as damage exactly, but as evidence. My shoulders never lost the thickness they had built in the first cutting seasons. My palms stayed hard at the heel and along the grip line of the axe. The slight forward tilt I had developed from moving through the low doorway and the narrow aisles of the original cabin never entirely straightened. My children teased me about it when they were old enough to tease, and I let them because the tilt was honest, and I had earned it, and there was nothing in me that wanted it gone. The cabin still stands in the drawer above the Little Missouri. Dory's notebooks are in a glass front cabinet in the main room, where visitors can see them without touching them. 9 ledger-sized notebooks with small, precise handwriting, numbered by winners, counting how many times a woman survived in a place everyone told her was not survivable. Beside the cabinet hangs a cross-section of the original inner wood shell, mounted on a backing board with the scorched courses from the winter of 1888, displayed exactly as they were when I pulled them from the wall on the 12th day of the storm, black at the inner face where the fire had taken them dry and sound, at the outer face where the cold had tried and failed to get through. The schoolhouse in Medora teaches the rent method now. They explain the physics. They show the diagrams. They use words like thermal conductivity in dead air space and R value, which is a term that came later from people who put numbers to things that Dory had understood by feel and observation, and 22 winters of careful measurement in a cabin everyone called a joke. They make it sound simple. They do not teach what it felt like. They do not teach the back room of Holt and Mercer Mercantile and the 11 people and the laughter and the 93 cents. They do not teach the first night alone in a cabin that smelled of mouse nests and old acacia sitting on the edge of a broken bed frame in the dark, listening to the wind and thinking about a 9-mile road back to a town that did not want you. They do not teach what it means to find 7 letters that were written for you and held back, and to understand that the years those letters represent cannot be recovered, only used. They do not teach what Dory wrote in her 12th winter, alone in this draw, while the wind worked at her walls with all the patience of something that has never needed to hurry. What saves you in a hard country is often the thing people laugh at before they understand it. They do not teach what it means to inherit something that the world has decided is worthless, and to find when you get there and open the box and read what was left for you that it was never worthless at all. It was just waiting for someone stubborn enough to finish it. I was 16 years old with 93 cents and nowhere to sleep. I inherited 12 acres of wind and a shack fit for storing turnips, and 11 people laughed, and Mrs. Ida Holt called it a joke handed to a girl, and I went south on a mule cart into the Badlands, and I found the box, and I read the notebooks, and I stacked my walls. The cold came for all of us. It always does. The question is whether you built before it arrived.